The most expensive contract I ever signed did not promise success. It warned me that if I failed, an empire would disappear without making a sound. I stared at the elegant leather folder resting on the conference table, while rain traced slow lines across the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me. The Manhattan skyline looked distant beneath gray clouds, and for the first time in my career, the city that had always rewarded confidence suddenly felt impossibly quiet. My name is Charlotte Hayes, and by the age of 31 I had earned a reputation for rescuing companies standing one decision away from collapse. Banks hired me when billion-dollar mergers unraveled. Family businesses called when generations stopped speaking to one another. Fortune 500 executives trusted me because I never allowed emotions to interfere with strategy. Numbers told stories. Leadership created patterns. Every broken organization left clues for anyone patient enough to notice them. That belief had never failed me. Until the morning I accepted a confidential meeting inside one of the most guarded office buildings in New York. The invitation arrived without a company logo, only a location and a time. 2 security checkpoints later, I entered a private boardroom overlooking the Hudson River. The room was almost silent except for the steady ticking of a vintage wall clock. An older attorney wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit stood beside the window with his hands folded behind his back. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Whitmore. His calm voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to protecting secrets rather than sharing them. Without unnecessary conversation, he slid the leather folder across the polished table toward me. Inside were financial summaries, organizational charts, handwritten notes, and one family name repeated on nearly every page. Moretti. Even before I finished reading the first document, I understood why the meeting had been hidden from public view. The Moretti organization controlled legitimate investments across real estate, logistics, hospitality, and international commerce. Their influence reached farther than most corporations would admit publicly. Yet, beneath impressive annual reports and polished executive portraits, something was quietly falling apart. Internal divisions, leadership disputes, unexplained financial inconsistencies, loyal executives leaving without explanation. Nothing looked catastrophic by itself. Together they formed a picture no experienced consultant could ignore. I closed the folder slowly. "Why me?" I asked. Mr. Whitmore answered without hesitation. "Because you repair institutions before people realize they are breaking." He paused before adding one final sentence. "And because our future chairman trusts almost no one." Before I could ask another question, the conference room door opened. Every instinct I possessed shifted toward the entrance. A tall man stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored black suit with no visible effort to impress anyone. His posture remained relaxed, yet the room itself seemed to grow quieter around him. Dark hair, calm blue eyes, measured movements that revealed complete confidence without demanding attention. He looked younger than I expected, perhaps 34, but there was nothing uncertain about the way he carried responsibility. This had to be Luca Moretti, the only heir to an empire balancing on invisible cracks. He acknowledged Mr. Whitmore with a slight nod before turning toward me. His expression remained composed, almost unreadable. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I understand you believe every business can be saved." His voice was steady, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "Most can," I answered honestly, "if people are willing to face the truth." For the first time, something resembling curiosity crossed his face. It disappeared almost immediately. He walked toward the conference table and rested one hand lightly against the leather folder. "Then let me save you some time." His eyes met mine with remarkable calm. "If this empire falls, it will not be because of money." The room fell silent again. Rain continued tapping softly against the glass while the city stretched endlessly beneath us. In that moment I realized I had not been hired to solve a financial crisis. I had been invited into a family that no longer trusted itself, and somewhere behind polished boardrooms, perfect reputations, and carefully chosen words, someone had already begun dismantling an empire from within. The drive to the Moretti headquarters the following morning took less than 20 minutes, but it felt as though I had crossed into another world. Manhattan bustled outside with impatient taxis, morning commuters, and glowing coffee shops opening their doors to another ordinary day. Inside the black sedan arranged by Mr. Whitmore, silence replaced the city's constant rhythm. I reviewed every page from the confidential folder again, marking inconsistencies with a fountain pen while trying to ignore one recurring thought. Luca Moretti had not looked like a man afraid of losing an empire. He had looked like someone already carrying the weight of it alone. The headquarters occupied an elegant limestone building overlooking the Hudson River. It resembled the offices of a global investment firm, rather than the headquarters of a family whose name inspired endless speculation. Glass reflected the morning sunlight. Fresh flowers decorated the reception hall. Employees greeted one another politely as though nothing unusual threatened the company. If I had relied only on appearances, I would have concluded that the organization was thriving. Experience had taught me that the most fragile institutions often look the strongest from the outside. An assistant escorted me to the executive floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows filled the hallway with natural light. Framed photographs lined the walls, showing decades of company milestones, charitable foundations, shipping expansions, scholarship programs, and community projects bearing the Moretti name. This was not simply a corporation. It was a family legacy woven into thousands of lives. When the conference room doors opened, I found 7 executives already waiting around a polished walnut table. Some offered welcoming smiles. Others measured me with quiet curiosity. Luca remained at the far end of the room, reviewing documents without acknowledging the conversations around him. His composure never appeared forced. It seemed natural, almost effortless. Mr. Whitmore introduced me as the independent restructuring consultant appointed by the board. A few executives nodded politely. One middle-aged board member folded his hands and asked, "How long do you expect this assessment to take?" "As long as honesty requires," I answered. A brief silence settled across the room. Several people exchanged quick glances before looking back toward Luca. He finally closed the folder in front of him and spoke without raising his voice. "Ms. Hayes reports directly to me during this review. Every department will provide complete access to financial records, strategic plans, and internal communications related to executive decisions." His statement sounded simple, yet the atmosphere changed immediately. Smiles became more careful. Chairs shifted almost imperceptibly. Someone quietly placed a pen on the table with unnecessary precision. Nobody challenged his decision, but I could feel resistance growing beneath polished professionalism. After the meeting ended, I spent the afternoon touring departments with senior managers. Every office appeared organized. Every report looked complete. Every explanation sounded reasonable. That consistency bothered me more than obvious mistakes ever could. Healthy organizations always contain small imperfections. Perfect presentations usually meant someone had spent too much time arranging what others were allowed to see. Near sunset, I stood alone beside the archive room reviewing historical financial statements when Luca entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside me without asking whether I wanted it. "You have barely spoken all day," he observed. "I learn more when people forget they are being evaluated." A faint smile crossed his face. "And what have you learned?" I closed the file in front of me. "Your executives answer questions well. Too well. They agree with each other before they agree with the facts." Luca remained quiet for several seconds before looking through the glass wall toward the empty hallway. "You reached that conclusion faster than my previous consultants." "They were looking for accounting errors," I replied. "I am looking for human behavior." He nodded once, almost as though he had been waiting for exactly that answer. Then he reached into his jacket and placed a small brass key on the table between us. "This opens the original family archive," he said calmly. "Nobody outside my family has entered that room in 12 years. I looked from the key to his steady blue eyes, realizing that the first door opening inside the Moretti Empire was not made of steel or stone. It was made of trust, and someone inside this family would almost certainly do everything possible to keep it closed. The brass key felt unexpectedly heavy in my hand as I stood alone in the executive archive long after most employees had gone home. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan slowly transformed into a sea of glowing lights reflecting across the Hudson River. Cleaning crews moved quietly through empty hallways while elevators carried the last executives toward the lobby. Somewhere inside that enormous building, thousands of people believed they worked for one of the strongest organizations in the country. Only a handful understood how close that confidence had come to breaking. I unlocked the original family archive and stepped into a room that looked less like a corporate records department and more like a carefully preserved museum. Walnut shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Leather-bound ledgers rested beside framed photographs showing generations of the Moretti family standing together at factory openings, scholarship ceremonies, charity hospitals, and neighborhood celebrations. Every image reflected stability. Every document suggested discipline. Yet experience had taught me that history rarely hid inside what people proudly displayed. It lived inside the details they assumed nobody would notice. I spent hours comparing handwritten financial journals from previous decades with the modern digital reports I had reviewed that morning. At first, everything appeared consistent. Revenue matched archived summaries. Property acquisitions followed predictable patterns. Board approvals aligned with official minutes. Then I noticed something surprisingly small. A charitable foundation established 18 years earlier had quietly changed oversight committees 3 different times without corresponding board votes. The foundation itself remained profitable, yet the reporting chain no longer matched the original organizational structure. I marked the pages with small adhesive notes before continuing. 20 minutes later, I found another inconsistency, then another. Individually, they meant very little. Together they formed a subtle trail leading away from accounting and toward governance. Someone had been moving authority from one office to another without attracting attention. It was not financial theft. It was institutional erosion. The next morning I arrived before sunrise carrying 2 binders filled with handwritten observations. The executive floor remained almost empty except for a receptionist arranging fresh flowers near the entrance. Luca's office door stood partially open. He was already inside reading correspondence while the first light of dawn stretched across the polished wood floor. He looked up as I entered but did not interrupt. Instead, he waited patiently until I placed both binders on his desk. "I think I found the first crack," I said quietly. He closed the letter in front of him and gave me his complete attention. I explained the shifting oversight structure, the missing approvals, and the gradual redistribution of executive influence that had unfolded over nearly 2 decades. Luca listened without speaking, occasionally studying the documents more than my explanation. When I finished, he remained silent for several moments before walking toward a large photograph hanging on the opposite wall. It showed 3 generations of the Moretti family standing together, outside their original shipping warehouse. "My grandfather believed organizations never collapse overnight," he said softly. "He used to say they disappear one compromise at a time." I joined him beside the photograph. "Your grandfather was right." Luca nodded once. "The difficult part is discovering who started making those compromises." Before either of us could continue, someone knocked gently on the office door. A woman from the executive assistant team stepped inside carrying the morning schedule. Her smile appeared warm, but I noticed a brief flicker of surprise when she saw the binders spread across Luca's desk. The expression lasted less than a second before disappearing behind perfect professionalism. Most people would never have noticed it. I did. She excused herself politely and left without another word. I waited until the door closed completely before speaking again. "Your reports are not the only thing people are watching." Luca looked toward the hallway with calm understanding rather than alarm. "You noticed her reaction. She was surprised we are moving faster than someone expected." His expression never changed, yet something thoughtful settled behind his blue eyes. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "we should stop assuming the danger is hiding inside old records." He looked back at the open binders. "It may already be sitting at the next conference table, smiling as though everything is exactly the way it should be." From that morning forward, I stopped treating the Moretti headquarters like a corporate office and started treating it like a family home where every hallway remembered conversations that nobody dared repeat aloud. Buildings always reflected the people who led them. The polished marble floors, the perfectly maintained conference rooms, the quiet efficiency of every department all suggested discipline. Yet beneath that polished surface, something invisible continued pulling people apart one careful decision at a time. Luca never questioned my instincts after our conversation about the archive. Instead, He quietly adjusted my schedule until nearly every senior executive agreed to individual strategy sessions over the next 3 days. Officially, we were conducting an organizational review. In reality, I wanted to understand the people long before I trusted the reports they approved. The first interviews revealed very little. Every executive praised the company's culture. Every department described stable operations. Every answer sounded polished enough to belong inside an annual shareholder report. I listened patiently while making only a handful of notes. It was never the prepared answers that interested me. It was everything surrounding them. Who hesitated before mentioning another executive? Who looked toward the door before answering certain questions? Who smiled naturally and who smiled because they believed they were expected to? By the afternoon of the second day, a pattern quietly emerged. Nearly every executive spoke about Luca with genuine respect. They described him as disciplined, thoughtful, and remarkably fair despite inheriting enormous responsibility at a young age. Yet whenever the conversation shifted toward extended members of the Moretti family, the atmosphere changed almost imperceptibly. Sentences became shorter. Compliments became cautious. Nobody criticized anyone directly, but everyone suddenly chose their words with unusual care. Families often protected one another through silence as much as loyalty. That afternoon, Luca invited me to attend a private family dinner held every Thursday inside the original Moretti estate overlooking the river. "You need to see us outside the boardroom," he explained while reviewing correspondence in his office. "Companies can hide behind procedures. Families cannot." The estate stood less than 30 minutes outside Manhattan, surrounded by towering oak trees whose autumn leaves painted the long driveway in shades of gold and amber. The mansion itself reflected generations of careful preservation, rather than unnecessary luxury. Portraits of previous generations lined the entrance hall. Antique clocks marked the passing hours with gentle chimes. Fresh flowers decorated every room, suggesting someone still believed beauty mattered even during difficult times. Dinner began with warm conversation about charitable projects, university scholarships, and plans for a children's medical foundation. At first glance, the gathering appeared almost ordinary. Luca greeted each relative with quiet respect. His aunt asked thoughtful questions about community programs. An older cousin shared stories about expanding the family's shipping business. Laughter occasionally filled the dining room beneath the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. If I had arrived without context, I would have believed this family represented the very definition of stability. Then dessert was served. A simple discussion about renewing leadership appointments unexpectedly shifted the emotional rhythm of the table. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued openly. Yet I noticed something far more revealing. One uncle complimented Luca while never making direct eye contact. A cousin casually changed the subject each time future succession plans were mentioned. Another relative stirred coffee long after the spoon should have stopped moving. Tiny signals. Almost invisible. Individually meaningless. Together they suggested quiet discomfort hiding beneath practiced elegance. When dinner finally ended, guests slowly dispersed into the estate gardens beneath a cool evening sky. I stepped onto the stone terrace overlooking the river, grateful for the silence after hours of careful observation. Luca joined me carrying 2 cups of tea. "You saw something," he said without asking. I accepted the cup and looked back through the illuminated dining room windows where smiling relatives continued polite conversations. "Yes," I answered softly. "Nobody at that table fears losing the company." Luca studied my expression carefully. "Then what are they afraid of?" I held his gaze before speaking the thought that had settled quietly in my mind all evening. They are afraid of the person who finally discovers why this family stopped trusting itself in the first place. After our conversation on the terrace, the Moretti estate no longer felt like a mansion to me. It felt like a carefully preserved memory that everyone was afraid to disturb. I remained there for another hour after most relatives had left, walking slowly through the quiet hallways lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow every visitor. Families often believed they inherited wealth through documents and property. In truth, they inherited habits, loyalties, fears, and unfinished conversations. Somewhere inside those walls, an old decision had continued shaping every new one for years. The following morning, Luca asked whether I would join him at the original shipping terminal where the Moretti organization had begun more than 50 years earlier. We drove north just after sunrise, leaving the crowded streets of Manhattan behind as the river reflected pale golden light beneath a cloudless sky. Unlike the elegant headquarters downtown, the terminal carried the honest wear of decades of work. Brick warehouses stood beside modern logistics facilities. Cranes moved cargo with quiet precision while employees greeted Luca with genuine warmth rather than rehearsed formality. He stopped to shake hands with warehouse supervisors, asked about their families, and remembered the names of workers who had been with the company for decades. Nobody behaved as though they were speaking to an untouchable executive. They spoke to someone who had earned their respect long before inheriting his title. Watching him there revealed something no financial statement ever could. Leadership was not the role he performed. It was the responsibility he carried every day. We toured the operations for several hours, reviewing shipment records and historical expansion plans. Everything appeared efficient, yet I noticed another subtle inconsistency. Several long-term investment approvals had been delayed repeatedly despite strong financial projections. The paperwork carried different signatures than the archived authorizations I had studied inside the family records. Individually, the delays seemed reasonable. Together, they suggested someone had quietly slowed the company's future without attracting attention. During lunch, we sat on a wooden bench overlooking the river while tugboats crossed the water in the distance. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence. Eventually, Luca spoke. "When I was 12, my grandfather brought me here every Saturday morning." He smiled faintly at the memory. He always said that if you wanted to understand a company, you had to leave the boardroom and meet the people who trusted it. I looked toward employees laughing together outside one of the warehouses. He built loyalty before profit. Luca nodded. He believed profit followed naturally when people believed they mattered. His words stayed with me long after we returned to headquarters that afternoon. Before entering the building, I reviewed my notes one more time. Every irregularity pointed toward the same conclusion. The organization was not collapsing because of poor leadership. It was being quietly weakened through hundreds of small administrative decisions made over many years. Someone understood the company well enough to damage it patiently instead of dramatically. As I organized the latest documents inside my temporary office, a light knock came at the door. Mr. Whitmore stepped inside carrying an aged leather journal wrapped carefully in protective cloth. He closed the door behind him before placing it gently on my desk. "Your observations reminded me of something," he said quietly. "This belonged to Luca's grandfather. He instructed me to protect it until someone finally started asking the right questions." I opened the journal carefully. The first pages contained handwritten reflections about leadership, family, and responsibility. Near the middle, a folded letter slipped onto the desk. It had never been mailed. Across the front, written in elegant blue ink, were only 7 words. "To the one who betrays us with a smile." I looked up at Mr. Whitmore in complete silence. He met my eyes with quiet certainty before saying the one sentence that changed everything I thought I understood. "Miss Hayes, the founder knew someone inside this family would eventually try to inherit the empire without deserving its trust." Mr. Whitmore left the journal on my desk and quietly closed the office door behind him, leaving me alone with a question that had apparently survived an entire generation. I carefully unfolded the unfinished letter and began reading the elegant handwriting of the Moretti family founder. It was not a confession. It was a warning. He wrote that every successful family eventually reached a moment when ambition began disguising itself as loyalty. He explained that outsiders usually attacked from the front because they had nothing to hide, while betrayal almost always arrived with patience, perfect manners, and familiar faces. Every sentence felt less like history and more like a map leading directly into the present. By the time I finished the final page, one realization settled heavily in my mind. The founder had never feared losing money. He had feared losing the values that made the family worthy of success in the first place. Later that afternoon, I met Luca inside the original archive where sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating decades of carefully preserved ledgers and photographs. I handed him the journal without speaking. He read several pages in complete silence before closing the cover with remarkable care. For a long moment he simply stared at the family crest embossed into the leather binding. "My grandfather never trusted easy victories," he said quietly. He believed that every important decision should make you uncomfortable, because responsibility always carries a cost. I nodded slowly. He also believed someone close to him would eventually confuse inheritance with entitlement. Luca gave a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. I wish that sentence surprised me. Instead of returning to executive meetings, Luca suggested we spend the afternoon visiting several charitable organizations supported by the Moretti Foundation. We drove across Manhattan without security escorts or formal announcements, stopping first at a neighborhood health clinic that had received family funding for more than 20 years. Doctors greeted Luca by name. Volunteers thanked him for replacing aging equipment months earlier without requesting publicity. At a nearby scholarship center, college students proudly showed him engineering projects funded through foundation grants established by his grandfather decades before. Watching those conversations changed something inside me. Every report I had studied measured profit, expansion, and market influence. None of them measured trust. Yet trust surrounded Luca everywhere we went. It appeared in the grateful smile of a teacher, the handshake of a maintenance supervisor, the laughter of students discussing their future careers. Those moments explained the Moretti legacy better than any annual report ever could. As evening approached, we stopped at a quiet cafe overlooking the river. The rush of the city softened into distant traffic while warm lights reflected across the water. Luca stirred his coffee thoughtfully before asking the question I suspected he had been carrying all day. Do you think my grandfather knew who would betray the family? I considered the journal carefully before answering. No. I think he understood human nature well enough to know someone eventually would. Luca looked out the window for several seconds. Then perhaps I have been protecting the wrong things. What do you mean? He folded his hands together. For years I believed preserving the company meant avoiding conflict inside the family. Now I am beginning to wonder whether avoiding difficult conversations allowed small compromises to become permanent habits. His honesty caught me by surprise because it carried no defensiveness, only responsibility. I realized then that he was no longer asking for my professional opinion. He was trusting me with the burden he had quietly carried since inheriting the organization. Before we left the cafe, my phone vibrated with a calendar reminder for the following morning's executive governance review. I opened the agenda and immediately noticed a last-minute addition submitted less than an hour earlier. A proposal recommending permanent restructuring authority for one specific family committee had been quietly inserted without discussion. The committee name appeared familiar because I had already seen it repeatedly inside the altered historical records. I turned the screen toward Luca. His expression remained calm, but his eyes lingered on the document longer than usual. Then he looked back at me and spoke with quiet certainty. Tomorrow, he said, someone is finally going to reveal whether they came to protect this family or inherit what someone else built. The executive governance meeting began exactly at 9 o'clock the next morning. Yet the atmosphere inside the boardroom felt different long before anyone spoke. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, illuminating the polished walnut table where 3 generations of Moretti leadership had once made decisions that shaped thousands of careers. Fresh coffee rested beside neatly organized folders. Every chair was occupied. Every expression appeared calm. Yet after weeks of studying this family, I had learned that silence often revealed more than conversation ever could. Luca entered last, greeting each executive with the same quiet respect he showed warehouse employees and scholarship volunteers. He never relied on authority to command a room. He relied on consistency. That simple difference explained why some people admired him, while others seemed quietly uncomfortable whenever he spoke. Mr. Whitmore distributed the printed agenda without comment. When the final page appeared before us, I immediately recognized the governance proposal we had discussed the previous evening. It recommended transferring long-term oversight authority to a permanent family committee, whose influence had quietly expanded over the past 18 years. Around the table, several executives nodded as though the recommendation represented nothing more than routine administrative housekeeping. I watched hands instead of faces. One director adjusted his glasses before reading the proposal. Another carefully aligned his pen with the edge of his notebook. Across the table, an older cousin of Luca folded his hands together just a fraction too tightly before forcing a relaxed smile. Small details.
Familiar patterns.
Not fear. Anticipation. Luca remained silent until everyone finished reviewing the documents. Then he looked toward me. Miss Hayes, he said calmly, would you share your assessment before the board votes? Every conversation stopped. I stood slowly, placing both hands lightly against the polished table. During the past several weeks, I reviewed decades of governance records, executive approvals, historical financial reports, and foundation oversight documents. I began. The company remains financially strong, operationally efficient. Community partnerships continue to thrive. Several executives nodded with visible relief. I allowed the silence to settle before continuing. However, I found a different pattern. Authority has gradually shifted through procedural revisions that rarely received full board discussion. Individually, those adjustments appeared reasonable. Together, they concentrated influence inside one committee, while reducing independent oversight intended by the company's founders. Nobody interrupted. I continued speaking evenly. This proposal would complete that transition permanently. The room remained remarkably still. Finally, the older cousin leaned forward with a polite smile. Organizations must evolve, Miss Hayes. Surely you are not suggesting modernization is a mistake. His tone remained courteous, but his question carried careful precision. I returned the same professional courtesy. Modernization strengthens institutions when transparency grows alongside authority. Here, authority expanded while transparency quietly diminished. Those are not the same thing. Across the table, I noticed two independent directors exchange thoughtful glances. They had not expected that distinction. Mr. Whitmore quietly opened the Founder's Journal and placed a photocopied page before every board member. The room filled only with the soft sound of paper sliding across polished wood. At the top of the page, written decades earlier in the founder's unmistakable handwriting, appeared one sentence. Never allow loyalty to become an excuse for avoiding accountability. No accusation followed. No names appeared. The sentence stood alone, carrying more weight than any argument could have. Luca finally spoke. My grandfather built this organization by trusting people enough to give them responsibility, and respecting them enough to expect accountability in return. Today I intend to honor both. He looked around the table with complete calm. The proposal will not move forward until every governance change from the past 20 years receives an independent review. Nobody argued immediately. The confidence that had quietly surrounded certain members only minutes earlier seemed noticeably weaker. As the meeting concluded, executives gathered their folders in thoughtful silence rather than hurried certainty. Walking beside Luca toward the hallway, I realized we had not exposed a single villain. We had done something far more important. We had replaced unquestioned assumptions with honest examination, and sometimes that was the first moment an empire truly began saving itself. The days following the governance meeting felt strangely different, not because the Moretti organization had suddenly become free of uncertainty, but because people had finally begun asking questions that had been postponed for years. Departments started reviewing long-forgotten approval records. Independent auditors requested archived meeting minutes without resistance. Executives who had once spoken only through carefully prepared statements now invited open discussions about accountability and future leadership. The company itself had not changed overnight. Its culture had simply remembered what honesty sounded like. I spent most of that week working inside the original archive, comparing decades of board decisions with the recommendations now moving through modern committees. Every page confirmed the same conclusion. The organization had never suffered from one dramatic betrayal. It had slowly drifted away from the principles that once protected it. Small compromises had become accepted traditions until nobody questioned them anymore. Late one afternoon, Luca joined me carrying 2 cups of coffee, placing one beside the growing stack of documents covering the large oak table. Warm autumn sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long golden reflections across handwritten ledgers that had survived generations. He looked noticeably less burdened than the man I had first met, although responsibility still rested quietly behind his steady blue eyes. Mr. Whitmore told me the review committee has already recommended restoring independent oversight, he said. I smiled. That is not the most important recommendation. He raised an eyebrow with genuine curiosity. Then what is? I closed the final ledger and turned it toward him. Every major decision should require written explanations that future generations can understand, not simply signatures that future generations inherit. He studied the page before looking back at me. My grandfather would have approved of that. We left the archive and walked slowly through the executive floor. Employees greeted Luca with the same respect I had witnessed from the beginning, but now I noticed something new. Their expressions carried relief instead of uncertainty. Conversations sounded more natural. Department managers stopped him briefly to discuss ideas rather than asking for permission. Trust was quietly returning, one conversation at a time. That evening the foundation hosted a small appreciation gathering for volunteers, scholarship recipients, and longtime employees inside the restored Riverside warehouse where the Moretti legacy had first begun. There were no elaborate speeches and no dramatic celebrations. Families shared meals together while children proudly displayed school projects funded by foundation scholarships. Retired employees laughed with young apprentices beginning their first careers. Music drifted softly through the historic building, while strings of warm lights reflected against the river outside. Standing among those ordinary moments, I finally understood what Luca had been protecting all along. It had never been the reputation of a powerful family. It had been the countless lives quietly connected to the choices that family made every day. We stepped outside onto the wooden dock overlooking the calm evening water. A cool breeze carried the scent of the river while city lights shimmered in the distance. For several peaceful minutes neither of us spoke. Words no longer felt necessary. You once told me you repaired companies before people realized they were breaking, Luca said quietly. Now I think you repaired something much more important. I looked toward the warehouse where volunteers, employees, and families continued laughing together. I did not repair your family, I answered honestly. Your family remembered who it wanted to become. He smiled with quiet gratitude before reaching into his jacket pocket. From a small envelope he removed the original brass key that had opened the family archive on my first day. He placed it gently into my hand. Keep it, he said. I looked at him with surprise. It belongs here. He shook his head slowly. No. It belongs to the person who reminded us that every legacy survives only when someone has the courage to protect the truth, instead of the appearance of success. As I closed my fingers around the worn brass key, I realized that somewhere between board meetings, forgotten journals, quiet conversations, and shared responsibility, I had stopped seeing Luca Moretti as the heir of an empire. I had begun seeing him as the man determined to build a future worthy of the family that trusted him to lead it. Several months passed before I realized the most important changes inside the Moretti organization could no longer be measured on financial statements. Independent oversight had become standard practice. Board meetings welcomed difficult questions instead of quietly avoiding them. Community investments continued expanding, not because public recognition demanded it, but because the family once again understood why those commitments had existed from the beginning. Walking through the headquarters no longer felt like entering a building burdened by silent uncertainty. It felt like stepping into an institution that had rediscovered its own reflection. My consulting contract officially ended on a bright spring morning. Sunlight poured through the familiar executive offices overlooking the Hudson River, illuminating the same polished conference room where everything had begun. The leather folder that once contained warnings and unanswered questions now held the final restructuring report. I signed the last page carefully before sliding it across the table toward Mr. Whitmore. He adjusted his glasses, reviewed the signature, and smiled with quiet satisfaction. Your work here is complete, he said. I looked around the room for a long moment. The city beyond the windows appeared unchanged, yet I knew I would never see it the same way again. When I first accepted this assignment, I believed I had been hired to repair a struggling organization. Instead, I had witnessed a family choosing integrity over convenience, transparency over tradition, and responsibility over comfort. Those were decisions no consultant could impose. They had to come from the people who would live with them long after every report had been filed away. Before leaving the building, I stopped one final time inside the original archive. The shelves remained filled with ledgers, journals, photographs, and letters preserved across generations. I carefully placed the founder's journal back into its protective case before resting the brass key beside it. I had carried the key every day since Luca first trusted me with the archive, but somehow it no longer felt like something I needed to keep. The room itself no longer depended on locked doors. It depended on people willing to protect the truth it contained. As I turned toward the exit, Luca appeared quietly in the doorway. He looked almost exactly as he had on the first morning we met, wearing a tailored dark suit and carrying himself with calm confidence. Yet there was one undeniable difference. The weight behind his eyes had been replaced by quiet peace. "You left the key," he said. I smiled gently. "It belongs to your family's future now." He stepped into the room and looked around at the shelves that held generations of history. "When you arrived, I thought saving this organization meant protecting everything exactly as it was." He paused before meeting my eyes. "Now I understand that preserving a legacy sometimes means having the courage to change it." We walked together through the building one last time, passing employees who greeted him with genuine warmth and confidence. Nobody lowered their voices as we approached. Nobody exchanged uncertain glances. Trust had returned so naturally that it almost seemed impossible to remember how fragile everything once felt. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of the river, while ferries crossed the water beneath a clear blue sky. I extended my hand, intending to say goodbye as professionals who had completed an extraordinary project together. Luca accepted my hand, but instead of letting go immediately, he smiled with quiet sincerity. "You once told me that every institution leaves clues for anyone patient enough to notice them," he said. "What did this one teach you?" I looked back toward the headquarters where generations had worked, hoped, struggled, and ultimately chosen honesty over fear. Then I answered with complete certainty. The strongest empires are never built by the people who inherit them. They are rebuilt every day by the people who choose to deserve them. Luca nodded, and for the first time neither of us needed another word. Looking back now, I still believe every organization tells a story through the choices its people make. The Moretti legacy taught me one lesson I will carry for the rest of my life. Wealth can build remarkable buildings. Influence can open remarkable doors. But only trust has the power to keep a family, a legacy, and a future standing long after every contract has been signed.